Is spirituality possible after deconstructing? I want to take just a couple minutes, I hope, to talk about this subject because I think it's an important one. And I've told my story in other videos. I've talked a lot about deconstruction from being an evangelical fundamentalist. But I've also talked about how I found a more open, kind of inclusive form of Christianity, and I still do call myself a Christian. And I think that the tendency for me is to kind of make videos that are mad or complaining. And I think there's a place for that. I mean, I absolutely think that toxic religious systems need to be critiqued. So I think that's an important part of the whole kind of deconstruction narrative on the internet. But one of the things that I think can happen if we're not careful is we spend all of our time complaining and deconstructing and talking about how terrible religion is. And we don't always find a way back to religion. And the thing that I've realized as I do this work is that people deconstruct for a lot of different reasons. And sometimes, I mean, I talk a lot about how I deconstructed from being a youth pastor, and I had all the privilege that I could possibly have in the evangelical world. And my deconstruction didn't come because anybody did anything bad to me. It came from reading the Bible in Greek and Hebrew and realizing that the fundamentalist worldview that I was given didn't hold water. But some people deconstruct because of, terrible toxic behavior by the church. A lot of women I know are deconstructing because of the church's terrible attitudes towards sexuality, towards gender, toward the kind of ways that evangelicalism can train you from even a young age, from being a young girl, with all sorts of really weird ideas about your body and sexuality. So there's things that even a lot of adults are still unpacking. There are people who have been really hurt by the church. There are people who have been gaslight by Christian leaders or let down by Christian leaders. Deconstruction is a huge thing. And I've said in other videos that one of the unfortunate things about the way that evangelical fundamentalism raises kids is that you often think that you need to believe two things to be a Christian. First is that the Bible is inerrant. And second, that you have to have this salvation experience and a relationship with God. And when you unpack those two things, especially the inerrant Bible, which is really obviously not true to anybody who actually stops to read the Bible, for a lot of people, the next step is, oh crap, I guess I have to be an atheist. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily true. So in this video, I want to give you a couple of reflections on coming back to faith after deconstructing. And this is not science-backed. This is not research-backed. This is just my opinion. It's just some reflections on mostly my own story, but a little bit from some other people too. So here are three things I think you should think about as you're deconstructing and potentially opening the door to spirituality again. The first thing that I wish I had realized when I started deconstructing, but fortunately I did get it pretty quick because I happened to deconstruct in seminary. So I was reading a lot of theology. And one thing that became really apparent to me when I was reading theology is the Christian tradition was much more rich and diverse than I ever realized. So one of the things that I was really lucky about was that I was able to very quickly see Christianity as a much bigger tent. And I don't think everybody gets this experience. So I think if you actually realize how big the Christian tradition is, when you're raised evangelical fundamentalist, you're basically given this wading pool and you're told like, this is all the water you can swim in. And when you come out of that world, and a lot of people just leave Christianity altogether, but there's actually a whole ocean of possibility in the Christian tradition. And when I read theology and read everything from the Catholics' idea of the dark night of the soul, which is a fantastic tradition. I remember reading things by like Paul Tillich, who was a 20th century theologian who had this really interesting idea that God wasn't even out there, that God was like the ground of our being. I remember reading the theologian Karl Barth, who talks a lot, had a very like almost universalistic approach to Jesus, that basically God had done this salvation thing, almost like whether we liked it or not. I'm probably oversimplifying Barth, so I apologize because it's complicated. But the point I want to get to is that the Christian tradition is really rich and really diverse. And one of the side effects of being raised in the cult-like elements of an evangelical fundamentalist world is you are prevented from actually seeing the richness of your own tradition. So if you want to explore Christianity again, and you don't have to explore Christianity, and I'll talk in a minute about other possibilities, but if Christianity is something you want to explore, you need to realize that it's actually a huge, open, big, rich tradition. There are so many different forms of it. There are so many theologians over centuries who have wrestled with like big, interesting subjects. I think, unfortunately, evangelical fundamentalists have given us a version of the faith that is probably dumber than most other points in history. There have always been these great, rich thinkers in the Christian tradition. And if you are exploring ways to reconnect to that, there is a big enough tradition there to hold faith, whatever faith ends up looking like for you. And for me, I left evangelical fundamentalism. I never want to have anything to do with that ever again. But faith is still there. Faith is still, like, Christian faith is still so much more rich. And it's still something that I identify with, actually because of that tradition, actually because Christianity is so open and rich, and there are so many interesting, vibrant ideas and ways of being Christian, that I've stayed connected to that tradition. The second advice I would give you that I think was really powerful for me is to reconnect with who you are as a human. So I'm English. My ancestors were English. And I found when I went to the UK and reconnected with the Anglican tradition and spent time at Anglican churches, I found a connection to who I am as a human being that was really powerful, that I could go to these places and realize, like, my ancestors worshiped here 1,000 years ago. And that's pretty incredible. That's a pretty powerful thing to go to, like, York Minster Cathedral, or I went to one of my favorites near Cambridge was Ely Cathedral, to go to these enormous, incredible buildings and realize people have been worshiping here for thousands of years, and I can connect into that tradition. That's pretty incredible. And I know Christians who have left Christianity and reconnected with indigenous spirituality, for example. I know people who have reconnected with, like, a Jewish heritage, if they have that. It doesn't really matter to me what you connect with. And this is, scandalous for some people, but I actually just think there's a lot of value in reconnecting with the spiritual tradition that your ancestors had, the spiritual tradition that you came from. And if you never explored that, even just as, like, a question, even if you're not going to, like, convert to something, just exploring where you came from and where your roots go can be a really interesting and powerful exploration of spirituality. And I think that can be really special. The third thing that I would tell somebody who's deconstructing, who wants to potentially explore faith again, is to get out of your head. Because I think so much of the way that I was given Christianity, it was just like, it all happened up here. Like, I know I talked about a relationship with Jesus. I would talk about that when I was younger, but it was still a very cerebral religion. It was a very, like, enlightenment-based, fact-based, like, I'm going to argue the right things. I'm going to believe the right things. I'm going to study this text and get the right doctrines. And it was such a heady type of cerebral thing. I think that really has the potential to disconnect you from deeper, richer forms of spirituality that aren't just about enlightenment thinking. So if you think about, for example, one of the traditions that I've really enjoyed is rediscovering Christian mysticism. And I followed people like Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest, and you can find him on YouTube. He's really great. But re-exploring these types of traditions that aren't just about the brain and aren't just about your reason, but are actually just about experiencing faith, actually about being in places. And there's a concept of orthopraxy, which is instead of orthodoxy. So orthodoxy is like believing the right things. Orthopraxy is doing the right things, practice, doing the right things. So if you can get out of your head and stop thinking about faith as these doctrines you have to believe, or believing the right things about God or the Trinity or whatever it is, and approach faith as something you can experience. I've even enjoyed finding meditation and mindfulness. For me, those have been really powerful ways that I've reconnected to spirituality. And it's almost a cliche at this point. I get that. It's a cliche to be like, well, I'm not a Christian anymore. I'm just spiritual. However, first of all, this is your journey. Nobody gets to judge you. I'm not going to judge you. But there's a lot of power in reconnecting to your body, reconnecting to the world around you in a way that's not just rational. So I think this can actually be a really incredible thing to explore different ways of experiencing spirituality that are rooted in maybe physicality, that are rooted in how you are embodied in the world with your own body as a start, for example, that there's more to spirituality than just thinking the right things, believing the right things, which was a very kind of Protestant way of approaching it. And the way that I was taught that spirituality had to be. Those are just a few really quick reflections. I may do another video on this in the future. But for those who are deconstructing and wondering what's next, I think, if you want to go like full-blown atheist, you could go for it. I'm not going to judge you. But I do think that there are a lot of people who deconstruct who still want to keep the door open to the possibility of spirituality. A lot of the reason people deconstruct is because, I've said this in another video, but people who deconstruct are often the ones who are really serious about it. And when you are super serious about something and you deconstruct and just have nothing in its place, it can be a really lonely, confusing experience. So I encourage you, if it's something that you want to explore, if it's something that you want to try, don't be afraid to tap into some of these things. Tap into the richness of the Christian tradition, even other traditions. I don't care. Like, explore religiosity, whatever that looks like for you. Explore your own roots and where you came from, and explore different ways of spirituality that aren't just all in your head, that are actually more experiential and more like in the world. Even if it's like going out to the forest and, hearing and smelling and actually experiencing the world around as spiritual, instead of just trying to make sure you're thinking the right things and holding the right doctrines. That's my advice. Take it or leave it. Take it with a grain of salt if you want. That's fine. I hope it's helpful to you. I hope it's interesting. As always, do leave your comments down below if you totally disagree with me. But I'd be interested to know what helped you rediscover faith, or what helped you rediscover spirituality, especially if you've gone through a period of deconstruction or atheism or whatever that is. Let me know down below. I'd love to hear your story. Do take a minute and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. I talk about all sorts of things, mostly Christianity, but from early Christianity to modern and everything in between. So yeah, take a minute, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it. Your support is so incredible and helps me keep making these videos. And I will see you next time.